He had built towers of glass and steel that pierced the skies of New York, signed deals that shifted markets across continents, and earned a reputation as a man whose will could bend the future. But when billionaire Alexander Grant stepped off his jet that night and walked into his Denver mansion, he would discover a truth that no fortune could shield him from. His empire was vast, yet his little girl was vanishing before his eyes. The winter air of Denver was sharp as crystal, slicing across the private runway where Alexander Grant's jet settled into silence. He descended the steps with the brisk assurance of a man accustomed to the world pausing for him. His tailored coat caught the wind, and behind him trailed assistants balancing files and phones still lit with messages from Tokyo and Zurich. Deals awaited. Markets never slept. But for once, Alexander's stride did not move toward limousines or boardrooms. It moved toward home. He had been gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks too long for a man whose daughter had just turned 4. Sophie. The name itself softened him, like a secret he carried beneath the armor of a tycoon. Tonight, he told himself, he would set aside the ceaseless hum of power and simply be a father. The gates of the Grant estate swung open. The mansion rose in the distance, a cathedral of stone and glass glowing against the snowy foothills. Once it had been designed to impress senators and CEOs. Tonight, Alexander wanted nothing more than the sound of small feet running to meet him. But no such sound came. The great doors opened with a hush, revealing the gleam of marble and chandeliers. Clara stood waiting, her dark hair coiled in its usual immaculate fashion, her smile practiced. Alexander's wife of 2 years, the stepmother who had promised him she would care for Sophie with tenderness. "You are home early," she said, voice smooth as glass. Alexander brushed past the greetings. "Where is Sophie?" "She is resting. A touch of a cold, I think." He did not wait. His footsteps echoed down the hall, past portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow with silent judgment. He reached the nursery door, pushed it open, and froze. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, not of crayons and milk. Sophie lay curled on her bed, her hair tangled, her cheeks pale as parchment. The teddy bear he had given her slumped in the corner, untouched. She stirred weakly at his shadow and whispered, "Daddy." Her voice was thinner than the snow falling outside. Alexander knelt beside her, every instinct of the boardroom falling away. He touched her forehead, too warm. He lifted the blanket and saw her frame, far leaner than he remembered. Her small hand clutched his wrist, trembling. "My stomach hurts," she whimpered. His heart clenched. The man who had stared down senators and rivals alike felt the ground shift beneath him. He turned toward Clara, who lingered at the door, arms folded. "What happened to her?" His voice was sharp, but beneath it quivered fear. Clara's eyes flicked aside. "Children get sick. She must have caught something. She sleeps a lot these days." Alexander heard the practiced calm in her tone, but his instincts, those that had saved him in 1,000 ruthless negotiations, screamed something else. Something was wrong. Without another word, he gathered Sophie into his arms. She weighed less than he remembered, light as a bundle of twigs. She buried her face against his chest, breathing shallow. "We are going to the hospital," he said. Clara began, "Alexander, there's no need to overreact." But his glare silenced her. The same gaze that once froze Wall Street investors now burned with paternal fury. "Move!" Within minutes, the black sedan tore through the icy streets, headlights carving the darkness. Inside, Alexander held Sophie close, murmuring words he had not spoken in years, promises not of mergers, but of protection. Her small fingers twitched at the rhythm of his voice, as if trying to believe him. The city blurred by. For the first time in decades, Alexander Grant did not feel like a master of the world. He felt powerless, terrifyingly powerless. At the emergency entrance, nurses swept Sophie from his arms, laying her on a stretcher beneath the harsh light. Questions fired like bullets: symptoms, duration, medications. Alexander answered with the fragments he knew, but each response sharpened his awareness of his own absence. He had been continents away while his daughter had withered. Through glass doors he saw her tiny frame swallowed by wires and monitors. Her lips moved, barely audible. "Daddy, don't go." He pressed his palm to the glass, breath fogging the sterile barrier. Deals, titles, fortunes. They meant nothing now. Only that small voice mattered. Behind him, Clara finally arrived, her heels striking the floor with slow precision. Her expression was the same mask she wore at charity galas, but Alexander, even in his anguish, saw something else, an unease flickering beneath the surface, the faint tremor of a hand adjusting her earring, and then a sound cut through the hall. "Mr. Grant?" A doctor, coat flaring, approached with urgency. His eyes were grave. "We need to run tests immediately. Her condition is not consistent with a common cold. Something more deliberate may be involved." Deliberate. The word struck Alexander like a blow. He turned toward Clara, whose face tightened ever so slightly. The marble floor beneath him seemed to tilt. He, the man who never missed a detail in a contract, had missed the most vital detail of all, the shadow under his own roof. And as the doors to the examination room closed, Alexander felt a chill that no winter storm could match. This was not sickness. This was something darker, and for the first time, he wondered if the greatest enemy he had ever faced was not across an ocean or in a boardroom, but waiting for him at home. The emergency ward of St. Mary's Hospital glowed under sterile lights, a kingdom of glass doors and echoing corridors where every second carried the weight of a life. Alexander Grant entered like a storm, Sophie cradled in his arms, her body trembling with a fever that seemed too heavy for a child so small. Nurses rushed to him, their voices brisk but urgent, guiding him toward a room where machines already hummed in readiness. For decades, Alexander had commanded attention in boardrooms across continents. Men with fortunes at stake fell silent when he spoke. But here, in this realm of beeping monitors and rushing white coats, he was stripped of power. He was no billionaire, no architect of empires. He was just a father, desperate, terrified, clutching his daughter as though the strength of his arms alone might keep her tethered to the world. "Set her down here, Mr. Grant," said Dr. Alvarez, a man with eyes sharp enough to read suffering in silence. "We'll take over now." Alexander hesitated, as if surrendering his daughter to strangers was an act of betrayal. But Sophie whimpered, and the decision was made for him. He lowered her onto the bed, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "Stay with me, Daddy," she whispered, voice breaking like glass. "I'm right here," he said, though his voice cracked, and for the first time in years he did not care who heard his weakness. Alvarez examined her quickly, stethoscope against chest, pupils tested under the sterile glow. Questions fired at nurses who moved like dancers in a grim choreography. High fever, rapid heart rate, stomach tenderness, prepare IV access, order a tox screen, full panel. The words cut through Alexander like foreign currency, valuable but useless in his hands. He was a man fluent in the language of mergers, profits, and power, yet here he stood illiterate before the vocabulary of medicine. He turned, searching for Clara. She had arrived moments later, her heels a jarring rhythm against the tile. Her face was painted with an expression of concern, too symmetrical, too polished. "I told you it was just a cold," she murmured, though her eyes slid away from Alvarez's piercing gaze. The doctor's brow furrowed. "A cold does not cause this. This is something else. We will know more after the tests." Alexander's fists clenched at his sides. His empire could buy him laboratories, specialists, entire hospitals if needed, but none of that mattered tonight. He would trade it all for 1 hour of his daughter's laughter. Sophie whimpered as the nurse inserted a needle into her small arm. Her eyes filled with tears, searching until they locked onto her father. Alexander stepped forward, kneeling beside her bed, whispering, "You're braver than any warrior I've ever met." Her hand reached for his, and he felt the fragile pulse beneath her skin. Minutes dragged into eternities. The machines beeped, recording numbers Alexander could not interpret, but each sound drilled deeper into his chest. He thought of the board meetings where he had spoken of legacy, of securing the grant fortune for generations. Yet what good was legacy if the heir to it lay dying before his eyes? Alvarez approached, his tone measured but grave. "We're running tests now. Her vitals are unstable. Mr. Grant, has your daughter had access to any medication at home?" Alexander's gaze flicked to Clara. She stood near the door, arms crossed as if warding off the question itself. She might have had some cough syrup," Clara said lightly. "Children are fussy sleepers. I may have given her a teaspoon or two." Alvarez's eyes narrowed. "Cough syrup does not explain this. We'll wait for toxicology." Alexander felt the air tighten around him. For years he had prided himself on reading people, detecting lies across mahogany tables, sensing betrayal in boardroom silences. He studied Clara now, the faint tremor of her hand adjusting her bracelet, the way her gaze refused to meet his. A sliver of suspicion, sharp and cold, pierced his chest. The minutes stretched. Sophie lay motionless, her small chest rising and falling under the harsh rhythm of machines. Alexander sat beside her, his large hands engulfing hers. He thought of the years he had spent conquering continents, believing presents could be replaced by gifts, ponies, dolls, trust funds. Yet here in this sterile chamber, none of those mattered. Only presence itself did. He leaned close, whispering stories he had once promised himself he would tell her at bedtime. Tales of tulips blooming in spring, of a father who built castles not of stone but of time spent together. His voice broke often, but Sophie's fingers tightened at every word, as if pulling strength from his repentance. Suddenly, a nurse entered with a folder of results, her expression pale. She handed it to Alvarez, who scanned the numbers, his face hardening with each line. Finally, he looked up, meeting Alexander's eyes. "This is not viral, not bacterial. Your daughter's blood shows high levels of sedatives. This is poisoning, Mr. Grant. Deliberate exposure." The words detonated like thunder. Alexander staggered, his mind recoiling from the syllables as if they were physical blows. Sedatives, poisoning, deliberate. His gaze shot to Clara. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped. Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear, then hardened into indignation. "Surely there's some mistake," she said, voice trembling just enough to betray her. Detective Harris, already summoned by protocol, stepped into the room. His presence was quiet but commanding, the kind that turned whispers into confessions. "Mr. Grant, we will need to ask questions. This is not just a medical case anymore. This is criminal." Alexander's body shook, not from fear, but from fury. Fury at Clara, at the betrayal carved into his home, fury at himself for every night spent in Paris or Shanghai while his daughter cried under the shadow of her stepmother. He turned back to Sophie, stroking her hair with trembling hands. Her eyes fluttered open, searching. "Daddy, hurts." His throat closed. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering a vow forged in fire. "I will never leave you again. No one will ever hurt you again. I swear it." Behind him, Clara shifted, her heels clicking nervously against the tile. Harris's gaze pinned her like a hawk, already marking the tremors of guilt. And in that stark room, beneath the relentless hum of machines, Alexander Grant, the man who once ruled empires, made a silent covenant. He would burn down every boardroom, abandon every fortune, if that was the price for his daughter's life. The night outside St. Mary's was a frozen cathedral of silence. Snow drifted against the glass windows, each flake a pale witness to the storm unfolding inside. Within the pediatric ward, Alexander Grant sat by his daughter's bedside, his world narrowing to the rise and fall of Sophie's fragile chest. The machines hummed in steady rhythm, a music of wires and beeps that had become his only measure of time. He had canceled everything: the meetings in Zurich, the conference call with Tokyo, the dinner with senators in Washington. None of it mattered now. Billion-dollar deals could collapse. Stock markets could burn. His universe was reduced to a 4-year-old child with trembling fingers clutching a crayon. The nurses had left a small box of paper and colors beside Sophie's bed, hoping to calm her. Children, they said, often spoke truths through drawings when words failed them. And so, in the pale hospital light, Sophie reached for a red crayon with unsteady hands. Alexander leaned close, watching. He expected the innocent sketches of a child: flowers, houses, maybe the teddy bear lying forgotten in the corner. But what unfolded on the page made his blood run cold. She drew a figure, tall, thin, hair as black as midnight. The woman's hand clutched a spoon, tilted toward a small, round face with tears streaming down its cheeks. Above the spoon she scrawled shaky letters: "Nuke Dang. Bitter water." Alexander felt his heart seize. He could not breathe. The strokes were crude, childlike, but the meaning was unmistakable. Sophie's wide eyes lifted to his, searching, as though to ask, "Do you see? Do you finally see what I have lived?" His throat tightened. He nodded slowly, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Yes, Angel, I see." For years, Alexander had trusted Clara. He had believed her gentleness, admired her composure at banquets, praised her patience with Sophie. Yet here was the unfiltered testimony of innocence, drawn in crayon, but sharper than any confession. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, pushing the paper toward him. "She says, drink. I don't want to. It makes me sleepy. But she gets angry." Her eyes brimmed with fear, the kind too old for a child so young. Alexander felt rage ignite within him. Not the cold, controlled fire of negotiations, but something primal, volcanic. Rage at Clara, who had dared to harm what he loved most. Rage at himself, who had been blind, away in distant cities while his daughter suffered in silence. He pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of the IV line, and rocked her as though she were still a newborn. "No one will ever make you drink that again," he vowed, his voice fierce with guilt and love. "I swear to you, Sophie, never again." The door creaked, and Detective Harris entered, his notebook in hand. His gaze flicked to the drawing, lingering. He did not smile, but his eyes softened, recognizing the weight of the child's testimony. "This is important," Harris said quietly. "It's not just scribbles. Children express trauma this way. We'll document it." Alexander handed him the page with a trembling hand. The billionaire's fingers, usually steady as marble, now shook like a leaf in a storm. "This is her truth," he said hoarsely. "Believe her, even if I failed to see it before." Harris nodded, sliding the paper into a protective sleeve. "We believe her." His voice carried the calm certainty of law, a stark counterpoint to Alexander's tempest. When Harris left, silence settled again. Clara had not appeared in the ward since the toxicology report. Somewhere in the mansion of her lies, she was likely rehearsing explanations, dressing her guilt in silk. But Alexander no longer cared for her words. The crayon had spoken louder than any testimony. Hours passed. Sophie, exhausted, drifted into shallow sleep. Alexander remained beside her, unable to close his eyes. He thought of the years wasted chasing horizons, nights in Parisian hotels, mornings under Tokyo skyscrapers, while Sophie was left alone under the shadow of her stepmother. Each memory struck like a hammer of regret. On the bedside table lay another sheet of paper. Sophie, half asleep, had begun another sketch before surrendering to dreams. Alexander lifted it gently. This one showed a small figure locked behind what looked like bars, and outside stood the tall woman again, her face twisted in harsh lines. A sob escaped his throat before he could stop it. His daughter's world had become a prison, and he had not seen it. The snow outside thickened, cloaking the city in white. To others, Denver slept in winter's embrace. But for Alexander Grant, sleep was impossible. He sat in vigil, the drawings laid before him like scripture, each stroke a revelation of his failure and a demand for redemption. He remembered his father's words long ago. Wealth is not what you pass down in banks. It's what you carve into the hearts of those you love. For years he had dismissed it as sentimentality, unfit for a man of industry. Now, staring at Sophie's fragile form, he understood. His empire was ash compared to the legacy of love he had neglected. The door opened again, softly this time. Dr. Alvarez entered, his expression grave, but not without compassion. He checked Sophie's vitals, nodded at their improvement, then turned to Alexander. "She's responding to treatment," Alvarez said. "The sedatives will clear with time. But the emotional wounds, those will take longer. She will need therapy, stability, and most of all, her father present." The words struck deep, not as criticism, but as truth. Alexander lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I will be here," he said. "From now on, I will be here." When Alvarez left, Alexander reached for Sophie's hand again. Her fingers curled instinctively around his, even in sleep. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a silent baptism of guilt and promise. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere in the distance, the city celebrated wealth, power, and ambition. But in this small hospital room, Alexander Grant discovered a richer calling, to be a father, not an emperor. And as he looked again at the drawing, the dark figure with the spoon, the bitter water forced upon a crying child, he felt his rage crystallize into resolve. This was not merely a family tragedy. It was a crime. The world had applauded him for building towers. Now it would witness him tearing down lies. For the first time, Alexander welcomed the storm. The corridors of St. Mary's seemed longer that night, like arteries of some vast machine pumping dread instead of blood. Alexander Grant sat in the family consultation room, the drawing Sophie had made folded in his coat pocket, pressing against his chest like a brand of fire. He had stared at them so long that the lines blurred behind his eyes, yet their meaning only grew sharper. A child crying, a spoon of bitter water, a shadow with raven hair. The clock on the wall ticked with merciless precision. Every second was a verdict he could not yet hear. The door opened and Dr. Alvarez entered with a folder in his hands. His face, calm, precise, built from years of telling families truths they wished never to know, was unreadable. Behind him trailed Detective Harris, notebook already in hand, his eyes steady as stone. Alexander rose, though his legs trembled. He had faced presidents, crossed swords with billionaires, and never once flinched. But now, in this room, he felt like a child awaiting judgment. "Mr. Grant," Alvarez began, placing the folder on the table, "we have the results from the toxicology screen." He opened the file, sliding a page toward him. The numbers glared up, alien, merciless. "Your daughter's bloodstream shows consistent, repeated exposure to benzodiazepines, sedatives, not accidental, not environmental. This was administered, and not once, but many times." The words fell like hammer blows. Alexander swayed, his hand gripping the edge of the table as though the earth itself had tilted. "Repeated?" His voice was raw, stripped of all its former polish. "Yes," Alvarez said firmly. "The levels suggest long-term dosing, low amounts at first, building over weeks. Enough to keep her drowsy, compliant, weak. It explains the weight loss, the fatigue, the abdominal pain." A silence filled the room, heavier than grief. Detective Harris stepped forward, his voice low but unwavering. "Mr. Grant, this is no accident. This is criminal administration of controlled substances to a minor. In plain words, someone has been drugging your child." Alexander felt the walls closing in. The air thinned. He thought of the nights Clara had sent him photos of Sophie sleeping peacefully, assuring him she was fine. He remembered her soft complaints at galas, murmuring that Sophie was restless, demanding, too attached to her father. He had brushed it aside as exaggeration. Now the truth was sharpened into steel. The door creaked again. Clara entered, her heels echoing across the tile like verdicts. She carried a shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders, as though arriving at a soiree rather than a reckoning. Her eyes flicked to Alvarez, then Harris, then to Alexander. "What is this gathering?" she asked, her tone clipped, brittle. "Alexander, why are you letting strangers frighten us? Surely Sophie is simply delicate." Alvarez cut her off, his voice cold. "Mrs. Grant, your stepdaughter has tested positive for repeated exposure to sedatives. This is not a misunderstanding." The color drained from her face, though she quickly forced a laugh. "Sedatives? That's absurd. Perhaps it was a prescription mix-up. Children are so fragile." "Enough," Alexander thundered, his voice a blade cutting through her excuses. He rose to his full height, no longer the distracted magnate but a father aflame. "Do not insult me with lies." Clara flinched, then steadied herself. "You're letting them twist things. I only ever wanted peace in this house. Sophie, she cried, she clung, she screamed when you were away. I gave her medicine to help her rest, that's all." The admission hung in the air, half formed, half denied. Harris's pen scratched against his notebook, recording every syllable. "You gave her medicine without prescription?" Harris asked coolly. Clara's lips tightened. "It was harmless. She needed discipline. She needed quiet." Alexander felt a roaring in his ears. Quiet. That was the motive? To silence a child? His child? Because she disturbed the perfection of Clara's curated world? "Do you understand what you've done?" His voice cracked under the weight of fury. "You poisoned her. You stole her laughter, her energy, her very childhood. For what? Convenience?" Clara's composure wavered. "Don't pretend this is only my fault," she hissed, her eyes flashing. "You were never here. You left her with me, always chasing deals, chasing power. You abandoned her long before I ever—" "Stop," Alexander snarled. His hand slammed against the table, the sound reverberating through the sterile room. "I may have failed by absence, but you—" His voice broke into a tremor of grief and rage. "You failed by cruelty." The silence that followed was suffocating. Harris finally spoke, his voice calm as steel. "Mrs. Grant, You are now a person of interest in an investigation of child endangerment and potential attempted homicide. You will need to come with me." Clara's eyes widened, fury twisting her features. "This is madness! You can't take me away based on the scribbles of a child and some numbers on a paper." But Harris merely gestured, and two uniformed officers stepped into the doorway, their presence undeniable. Alexander sank back into his chair, his strength bleeding out. He no longer looked at Clara. She was no longer a wife, no longer part of his world. She was the shadow from Sophie's drawings, exposed under the light of truth. As the officers led her away, she turned one last time, her voice venomous. "She will always come between us, Alexander. Always. You'll see." But Alexander did not answer. His gaze remained on the folder of results, on the proof of what had been done. His empire had been built on numbers, on data, on cold facts. Now numbers condemned the woman he had trusted. When the door shut, he rose slowly and walked back to Sophie's room. She lay there, tiny and frail, but her breathing steadier now. The machines still sang their vigil. He sat beside her, smoothing the hair from her face. "Daddy's here," he whispered, "and no one will ever hurt you again." The crayon drawings were still in his pocket, pressing against his chest. Evidence, yes, but more than that, they were a mirror. A reminder of how close he had come to losing everything, not to competitors or markets, but to silence within his own home. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over Denver, pale and uncertain. For Alexander Grant, it felt less like sunrise and more like Judgment Day. The pediatric ward was quieter now. The hum of machines had steadied, Sophie's breathing softer, but the air itself carried a weight, an unspoken anticipation, like the silence before a jury delivers its verdict. Alexander sat close, his large frame hunched, one hand holding his daughter's tiny fingers as though they were the last tether keeping him anchored to the world. His eyes, once sharp as steel in the glare of corporate battles, were now swollen with sleeplessness. For 3 days he had not left her side. Detective Harris returned, carrying not a badge of authority, but a small box filled with crayons and sheets of white paper. He set it gently on the bedside table, his voice low. "Children sometimes find it easier to tell their story this way. If she draws, if she speaks even in fragments, it matters." Alexander hesitated. The thought of his daughter reliving pain felt like cruelty. Yet he knew truth was the only weapon left. He nodded. "We'll try." The nurse adjusted Sophie's pillow, and Sophie blinked awake, her eyes still glazed with fatigue but alive with the innocence of a child who cannot fully name the shadows pressing in on her. Harris sat on the edge of a chair, lowering his voice as if speaking to his own child. "Sophie, would you like to play a game? You can draw anything you want. Maybe show us what happens at home." Her small fingers reached for a crayon, hesitant at first, then firmer as though memory guided her hand. She drew again the tall woman, dark hair cascading, face twisted in angles that looked harsher than the real Clara, yet truer. The woman held a spoon, and beside it she scrawled jagged lines that seemed like tears. Alexander's heart twisted. He had seen this before, but this time Sophie lifted her gaze, her voice breaking into words. "She gives me all the bitter drink," Sophie whispered. "Says I must be quiet, must sleep. If I cry, she gets angry." Alexander felt the world fracture. He bent close, tears gathering despite his effort to be strong. "How often, Angel? How often did she give it to you?" Sophie looked down, her small hand trembling as she tried to count on her fingers. "Many nights, sometimes in the morning, too. When you were away, Daddy." The words cut deeper than any accusation. Each syllable was both confession and blade, reminding him of every absent boardroom night, every jet that stole him from her side. "Did she Ever hurt you, Sophie?" Harris asked gently. The child hesitated, then lifted her sleeve. Bruises, faint but undeniable, marred the tender skin of her arm. She traced them with her fingertip, as though ashamed. "She held me hard. Too hard. Said I was bad when I wanted you." Alexander's body shook. Fury and grief collided inside him until he thought his chest would shatter. He reached for her, drawing her into his arms, but carefully, as though she were made of glass. "You are not bad," he whispered fiercely, tears spilling freely. "You are good. You are perfect. And none of this was your fault." Sophie pressed her face into his chest, sobbing quietly, her small voice muffled against his shirt. "I just wanted you, Daddy." The words undid him. He wept openly, unashamed, every tear a confession of guilt. He had conquered continents, but he had abandoned the only kingdom that mattered, the heart of his daughter. Harris, standing nearby, lowered his eyes respectfully, giving father and child the sanctity of their grief. But he spoke softly, a promise carved into air. "Mr. Grant, her words will hold in court. Her drawings, her testimony. We will make sure they are heard. Clara will answer for this." Alexander looked up, his tears hardening into resolve. "Not just answer. She will never come near Sophie again. I swear it." For the next hour, Sophie spoke in fragments, through drawings, through whispers, through tears. She described the spoon, the bitter liquid, the nights she drifted into forced sleep while the world outside went on without her. She spoke of the bruises, the harsh hands that punished her for longing, for needing, for loving. Every word pierced Alexander deeper, but also forged his determination. He no longer saw himself as a titan of industry. He saw himself as a father called to war, not against corporations or rivals, but against the shadows that had taken root in his own home. When Sophie's words dwindled into exhaustion, Alexander tucked the blanket around her, smoothing her hair with hands that still trembled. She clung to his sleeve, unwilling to let him go. "I'm here," he said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Forever." And this time, he meant it. Outside the room, Harris closed his notebook, his eyes meeting Alexander's with quiet gravity. "We have what we need. It will be painful, but justice will come. The court will hear her story." Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. "And the world will hear it too. Not as gossip, not as scandal, but as truth. She will never be silenced again." The hospital lights flickered as dawn approached, painting the snow beyond the window in pale gold. For Sophie, that light was more than morning. It was the beginning of release, the first step toward healing. And for Alexander, it was absolution, written not in ledgers or contracts, but in a child's fragile voice, finally free to be heard. The snow in Denver had not stopped for 2 days. It lay thick against the city, muffling every sound except the occasional siren that pierced the silence. From the window of St. Mary's pediatric ward, Alexander Grant watched the world vanish beneath white drifts, his reflection staring back like a stranger, hollow-eyed, sleepless, trembling with fury. Sophie was resting now, her breathing steady, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. Yet Alexander could not rest. He had promised her safety, but a promise was not enough. Promises, he knew, could be broken. He needed proof. He needed to bury Clara's lies so deep that no judge, no lawyer, no whisper of influence could ever set her free again. Detective Harris returned that morning with a folder tucked under his arm, his boots dusted with snow. His expression was carved from granite. "We pulled phone records, financial statements, and intercepted some messages. Harris said without ceremony. He placed the folder on the table beside Sophie's bed. Mr. Grant, what we've found suggests this was not about convenience. It was about money, about inheritance. Alexander's breath caught. Inheritance. Harris opened the folder, spreading photographs of text messages across the table. Words glowed on the printed sheets, the casual cruelty of greed laid bare. If she keeps getting weaker, he won't notice. He's never home. The girl is the heir. Once she's gone, or too sick, everything falls to me and Alexander. Patience. A little more each week. He'll blame stress, not me. Each line was a knife. Alexander read them again and again, his mind screaming denial even as his eyes confirmed the truth. Clara had not merely sought silence or peace. She had plotted, calculated, measured doses like columns on a ledger, not to ease Sophie's cries, but to erase Sophie herself. She saw Sophie as an obstacle, Harris said grimly. Not as a child, not as family, as competition. Alexander felt his hands curl into fists, veins burning with rage. She wanted my daughter out of the way to claim my fortune. Exactly. Your current will names Sophie as the sole heir. Clara knew that. We have emails from her confidant, someone she trusted too much, where she complains openly. She calls Sophie the little barrier. She even jokes that your constant traveling made her task easier. Alexander closed his eyes, fighting the nausea rising within him. He remembered every gala where Clara smiled beside him, every charity event where she played the gracious hostess. All the while, behind the smile, she was calculating the slow poisoning of a child. When he opened his eyes, they were no longer clouded by grief alone. They burned with purpose. Bring every piece of this to court, Alexander said, his voice hoarse but resolute. I will not let her name touch my daughters again. Harris nodded, but his tone remained cautious. She will fight. She has lawyers. She will claim innocence, that she only meant to soothe Sophie, that she was overwhelmed. These messages are strong, but we will need your testimony, too. Your presence in that courtroom will mean everything. Alexander lowered his gaze to Sophie, who stirred faintly in her sleep, clutching her teddy bear. For years he had avoided courtrooms, preferring to negotiate in glass towers, away from the public eye. But now he understood. This was not a corporate war. This was his daughter's survival. He reached for Harris's hand, shaking it firmly. I will be there. I will stand before the world, and I will say what my daughter could not, that she was betrayed under my roof, that I failed her once, but never again. That night, unable to sleep, Alexander wandered the quiet halls of the hospital. Every door he passed revealed fragments of stories, mothers holding infants, fathers pacing, children dreaming under machines. He thought of the irony. Men like him could command empires, but here, in these sterile rooms, the true battles were fought not with contracts, but with presence. Returning to Sophie's room, he found another drawing on the bedside table. Sophie, half awake, had reached again for her crayons. This picture showed a house, large with many windows. Inside, a small girl stood in one room, tiny and alone. In another, a tall woman held a bag of money, her face sharp, triumphant. Alexander lifted the page slowly. Even a child had understood the truth before him. Clara's love had never been for family, but for fortune. Tears blurred his vision. He bent close, kissing Sophie's forehead, whispering into the night. Your light is worth more than every dollar in the world, and she will never take it from you. The following morning, news had already begun to spread. Whispers leaked from police precincts into the media. Reporters camped at the hospital gates, cameras poised to devour scandal. Billionaire's wife accused of poisoning stepdaughter, the headlines would soon scream. Alexander did not care. Let the world know. Let them see the truth. Clara, meanwhile, was held in custody. Through her lawyers, she issued denials, declarations of love, excuses of stress. But the evidence piled higher. Bank transfers, messages, whispers of secret meetings with an old lover who encouraged her ambition. It was no longer a story of neglect. It was conspiracy. And in the quiet heart of the storm, Sophie slept peacefully for the first time in months, her father watching, guarding, present. That evening, Harris returned once more, a grim smile at his lips. "We've confirmed it. Clara's motive wasn't just inheritance. She was also funneling funds out of your accounts to cover debts. She saw Sophie as the wall between her and absolute control." Alexander leaned back, exhaustion and fury mingling. She wanted everything, and she nearly succeeded. "No," Harris corrected gently, glancing toward the bed where Sophie stirred. "She failed, because Sophie survived, because you came home in time." Alexander's eyes softened, following the rise and fall of his daughter's chest. He whispered a vow not to Harris, not to the world, but to himself. "The fortune I leave behind will never again matter more than the child I hold before me." And for the first time in his life, Alexander Grant, billionaire, titan, emperor of glass and steel, understood what true wealth was: a heartbeat in the dark, a hand small enough to fit inside his own, and the fragile miracle of innocence still alive despite betrayal. The holding room at the Denver Police Department was stark and colorless. Concrete walls, a single table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor. It was a place designed to strip illusions, where lies died under fluorescent light. Alexander Grant stepped inside, escorted by Detective Harris. His tailored coat, once armor in boardrooms, hung heavy on his shoulders. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a father carved from sleepless nights, fury, and grief. Across the table sat Clara. Her dark hair was still flawless, pinned neatly as if she were preparing for a gala. Her lips painted, her nails manicured, but the polish could not mask the tremor in her hands. She looked up, and for a fleeting moment her eyes widened at the sight of Alexander. Then she smiled, thin, rehearsed. "Alexander," she purred as though greeting him at a charity dinner. "Finally. You've come to your senses. Surely you realize this has gone too far. They're trying to turn you against me." Alexander's gaze was glacial. He did not sit. He did not blink. He let the silence stretch until even the hum of the light seemed loud. Then, his voice low and raw. "What did you do to my daughter?" Clara laughed lightly, though the sound cracked. "Your daughter? Our daughter, Alexander. I cared for her when you were across oceans. I put her to bed. I dressed her. I kept her safe." "Safe?" The word tore from him like thunder. He slammed his palms onto the table, the steel groaning under his weight. "You poisoned her. You bruised her. You silenced her with drugs until she could barely stand. Do you dare call that care?" Clara's mask faltered. She glanced at Harris, who stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching with predator calm. Then she leaned forward, her smile twisting into bitterness. "You left me with her, Alexander. Always gone, always chasing the next empire. Do you know what it's like, raising someone else's child alone, while the world worships you?" She clung, she cried, she screamed for you. Every day she reminded me I was second, a placeholder in your perfect life. Alexander's chest heaved. "She is 4 years old. A child. And you—" His voice broke, but he forced it steady. You chose cruelty because you couldn't bear her love for me? That is your excuse? Clara's eyes hardened, the veneer of elegance crumbling. Don't pretend this is only about love. We both know what truly matters to men like you. Power, wealth, legacy. And she... Her voice dripped with venom. She was the legacy. Not me. Always her. You made sure of it with your will, with your lawyers, with every smug word about her being your heir. Do you know what it feels like to be married yet disposable? To stand beside you and realize everything goes to a child who barely knows the world? Her confessions slashed the air, half rage, half desperation. Alexander lowered himself slowly into the chair, never breaking his gaze. His face was carved from stone, but his voice trembled with both fury and heartbreak. You married me for wealth. You endured my absence for position. But you looked at my daughter, my Sophie, and saw only an obstacle to be erased. You wanted her gone so you could stand alone atop a pile of ashes. Clara's composure shattered. She slammed her fist against the table, eyes wild. Yes, I was tired of being second, tired of watching her smile tear you away from me, tired of knowing every bedtime story you never told her was worth more to you than any word I spoke. I wanted my place, Alexander. I deserved it. Detective Harris stepped forward, voice firm. Mrs. Grant, I advise you to stop speaking unless you wish your own words to bury you. But Alexander raised a hand. Let her speak. Let her pour out the poison she kept hidden in my home. Clara glared at him, chest heaving, her mask gone entirely. She looked less like the polished socialite of Denver's elite and more like a caged animal, cornered by her own greed. You think this is all my fault? She spat. Where were you, Alexander? Flying over oceans, shaking hands, building towers? You left her with me because it was easier. Because deep down you knew she was a burden. Don't stand there and pretend to be the hero now. You abandoned her long before I ever... The word died on her lips. Alexander had risen, leaning across the table, his face inches from hers. His voice was no longer thunder. It was ice, deadly in its quiet. I was blind, I was absent, and for that, I will live with guilt until my last breath. But I never betrayed her, not once. You did. You looked at a child's love and saw a threat. You looked at her laughter and saw a wall between you and fortune. You broke her innocence for greed. For the first time, Clara faltered, her eyes darting to Harris as though searching for rescue. But Harris only wrote in silence, every word sealing her fate. Alexander straightened, pulling Sophie's crayon drawings from his coat pocket. He spread them on the table, the tall woman with dark hair, the bitter spoon, the crying child, the bars of a prison. Even she told the truth, Alexander said, his voice cracking. In colors and paper, my daughter painted your soul, and now the world will see it too. Clara stared at the drawings, her face paling. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Harris closed his notebook, his voice calm but final. This will go to court. Her testimony, the toxicology, your messages, and now, your own words. There will be no escaping this, Mrs. Grant. Two officers entered, their presence filling the room. Clara's bravado collapsed into a whisper, barely audible. She stole you from me. Alexander turned toward the door, his coat brushing the floor. He did not look back. His final words lingered in the air like judgment. No, you gave yourself away, and I will never forgive you. As the officers led Clara out, her heels scraping against the concrete, Alexander felt both broken and unburdened. The confrontation had not healed him, but it had carved truth into stone. The shadow was no longer hidden. When he stepped back into the cold Denver morning, snowflakes stung his face like shards of glass. Yet for the first time in years, he felt clarity. He would walk through every storm, every courtroom, every headline, not as a titan defending an empire, but as a father protecting his child. And in that vow, Alexander Grant found a power greater than any fortune, the resolve never to abandon Sophie again. The courthouse of Denver was a fortress of stone, its marble pillars gleaming in the winter sun. On ordinary days, it was a place of dusty files and whispered negotiations. But today, it was a stage. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing like lightning, their voices clashing in a storm of questions. "Is it true she poisoned the child? Mr. Grant, will you testify against your wife? What does this mean for the future of your empire?" Alexander Grant stepped from the black car, flanked by detectives, his hand clasping the tiny palm of Sophie. She wore a pale dress beneath her winter coat, her hair tied neatly by a nurse's gentle hand. Though still fragile, she walked with quiet courage, her small fingers gripping her father's as though anchoring herself against the storm. Alexander did not answer the questions. He did not look at the cameras. For the first time in decades, headlines meant nothing to him. The only truth he cared for was the one Sophie carried in her trembling voice and her crayon drawings. Inside, the courtroom brimmed with tension. Spectators filled the benches, the elite of Denver whispering in disbelief. On one side sat Clara, her beauty sharpened into severity, her lawyers stacked with papers and rehearsed defenses. On the other side, Alexander sat with Sophie, Detective Harris close behind, and Dr. Alvarez prepared as a witness. The judge entered, robes sweeping, and silence fell like a curtain. The trial began. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented the toxicology reports, the bruises photographed by nurses, the testimony of Dr. Alvarez. Each piece of evidence fell like a stone into still water, ripples spreading through the courtroom. Then came Sophie's drawings, enlarged on screens. They seemed almost unbearable to look at. A tall woman with a spoon, a crying child, bars of a prison. Simple crayons, yet they carried the weight of truth. The prosecutor spoke softly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not art. This is memory. This is how a 4-year-old survived what words could not yet explain." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the judge's eyes lingered on the images, heavy with sorrow. Clara's attorneys rose, weaving arguments of stress, of misunderstanding, of a stepmother overwhelmed by responsibility. They painted her as a victim of circumstance, a woman unfairly maligned. But the veneer cracked with each message Harris revealed, texts dripping with greed, words cold as steel. "When she's gone, the fortune is ours." The jury shifted, their faces tightening. The facade of innocence faltered. Finally, the judge called Alexander to the stand. He rose, each step slow but steady, Sophie's eyes following him. For years he had spoken to rooms filled with power, shareholders, senators, rivals, but never had he felt his voice so heavy with consequence. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat. "Mr. Grant," the prosecutor began, "you are known as one of the most powerful men in this country. Why are you here today?" Alexander's voice, low and resonant, filled the courtroom. "Because power means nothing if you cannot protect your child." He spoke then, not as a billionaire, but as a father stripped bare. He confessed his absences, his blindness, his guilt. He described the night he returned to find Sophie frail and trembling, the moment she whispered, "Daddy, it hurts," the crayon drawings that tore the veil from his eyes. "She is 4 years old," Alexander said, his voice breaking. 4. and yet she carried suffering that no empire, no fortune, no adult should ever bear. I failed to see it, but I will not fail again. Not here. Not now. Silence swallowed the room. Even the jury, hardened by countless trials, sat transfixed. The defense attempted to shake him. They spoke of ambition, of bias, of the possibility that stress had clouded Sophie's testimony. But Alexander only reached into his pocket and drew out the final crayon sketch Sophie had made the night before. A tulip blooming beneath sunlight, a child smiling beside her father. "This," he said, holding it high, "is what she deserves. Not drugs, not bruises, not fear. Light, safety, a future. And I will give it to her, even if it costs everything else." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, hushed by the judge's gavel. When Clara was asked to speak, her voice wavered between indignation and desperation. She claimed love, she claimed loneliness, she claimed she had been driven by neglect. But the jury had already seen too much. Her words were drowned beneath the weight of evidence and the quiet power of a father's vow. As the session adjourned, the verdict still awaited, but the tide was clear. Clara's empire of lies had collapsed. Outside, reporters shouted again, cameras flaring. Alexander lifted Sophie into his arms. She looked at the flashing lights with wide eyes, then buried her face in his shoulder. He whispered to her so softly only she could hear, "It's almost over, Angel. The darkness is ending. The world will never touch you that way again." And for the first time since the nightmare began, Alexander believed it. The trial stretched on for weeks, its echoes spilling into every newspaper and television screen. Headlines screamed betrayal, greed, poison, inheritance. Clara's name became a synonym for cruelty, whispered in boardrooms and coffee shops alike. But within the high walls of the Grant estate, stripped now of its illusion of security, life was shifting in a quieter, deeper way. For the first time in years, Alexander Grant closed his calendar. The board meetings, the global summits, the negotiations that once carved his days into fragments, all were gone. His empire did not collapse without him. But for the first time he realized, even if it had, he would not have cared. Every morning, instead of boarding a jet or scanning stock reports, he walked down a simple hallway to Sophie's room. The winter sunlight fell through her curtains, catching the dust in golden shafts, and there she would be, sometimes still sleeping, sometimes already awake, coloring. He would kneel beside her, brush the hair from her eyes, and whisper, "Good morning, Angel?" And she would smile, faint but growing stronger each day. It astonished him, the power of such small rituals. Reading a storybook before bed, pouring cereal together in the kitchen, holding her hand while crossing the snowy garden. He had thought power lived in towers of glass and steel. Now he discovered it lived in the curl of his daughter's laughter when he pretended to stumble, in the way her eyes lit up when he appeared in the doorway. Present. Real. Hers. The therapists warned him. Recovery was not swift. Trauma lingered. Nightmares came. Sometimes Sophie woke in the dark, crying that the bitter water was coming again. But Alexander would be there, holding her close, whispering, "It's over. You're safe. Daddy's here." Slowly the cries softened into trust. Slowly the nightmares gave way to dreams. He began canceling projects, ventures worth hundreds of millions, without hesitation. His advisors panicked. Investors called him reckless. But Alexander only smiled, a quiet, tired smile. "I have something more valuable than your numbers," he told them. And when they scoffed, he simply hung up. Because how could they understand? How could men who measured life in profits understand the weight of a tulip blooming in Sophie's small hands? One afternoon in early spring, he took Sophie to the park. The air was still cool, but the earth had begun to stir. Birds sang from branches that only weeks ago had been skeletons of winter. Sophie, wrapped in a light coat, pointed eagerly at the swings. Alexander pushed her gently, his massive hands cautious as though she were porcelain. "Higher, Daddy!" she cried, her laughter ringing like bells. He pushed a little more, his heart racing not with fear but with wonder. This sound, this moment, was wealth no vault could hold. Later they sat on a bench beneath budding trees, sharing ice cream. Sophie smeared chocolate across her nose, and Alexander laughed, a sound he had nearly forgotten he was capable of. A passerby recognized him, the billionaire from the news, and whispered in awe. But Alexander did not hear. He was too busy wiping chocolate from his daughter's face, too busy memorizing the sunlight in her hair. At night, when Sophie had fallen asleep, Alexander would sit alone in the study. The shelves were lined with contracts and ledgers, but he ignored them. Instead, he opened a leather-bound notebook and began to write. Not numbers, not strategies, but stories. Stories for Sophie. Fairy tales where villains fell and children triumphed, where tulips bloomed after storms. He wrote them long into the night, each word a promise of presence, each tale a seed of healing. His staff noticed the change. The once distant master now lingered in hallways, crouched to tie a shoelace, carried toys under his arm. The estate, once echoing with sterile wealth, filled with the sound of bedtime songs and crayons scratching across paper. Even the bodyguards smiled more often. Alexander's heart, once armored in ambition, was cracking open. He began to see the world through Sophie's eyes, the wonder in a puddle, the triumph in finishing a puzzle, the sacredness of a bedtime kiss. One evening, as the sun melted into gold across the horizon, Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, can we plant flowers?" He looked at her, at the earnest hope in her eyes, and nodded. Together, they knelt in the garden, hands in soil, placing bulbs beneath the earth. Sophie giggled when dirt smeared his expensive shirt, and Alexander laughed with her. When they were finished, she patted the soil with tiny hands and whispered, "Grow strong." He stared at the patch of earth, at the small tulips waiting to rise, and he thought, "This is the legacy I should have built all along. Not towers, not markets, but life that grows, tender and resilient." Days later, he found Sophie in the garden again, crouched by the first green shoot pushing bravely through the soil. She clapped her hands, eyes wide with wonder. "Look, Daddy, the flower's not afraid anymore." He knelt beside her, tears stinging his eyes, and gathered her into his arms. Neither was he. Spring arrived quietly in Denver, as though the earth itself wished not to disturb the fragile miracle of healing inside the Grant estate. Snow melted from the rooftops, rivers of silver streaming into the streets. The air softened, carrying the scent of new blossoms, and the trees, once skeletal in their winter grief, began to clothe themselves in tender green. In the garden behind the mansion, once a showpiece for galas and charity dinners, small tulips pushed bravely through the soil. Their heads bowed at first, as if uncertain of the sun, then slowly unfurled, defying the memory of frost. Sophie was the first to notice. One morning she tugged at Alexander's sleeve, her voice alight with wonder. "Daddy, the flowers! They woke up!" Alexander followed her to the garden. There, beneath the pale morning light, stood the tulips they had planted together only weeks ago. He remembered her tiny hands patting the earth, whispering, "Grow strong." Now, here they were, delicate, fragile, yet undeniable in their defiance of winter. Sophie crouched beside them, her fingers tracing the curve of a red petal. Her eyes, wide and luminous, reflected something greater than simple joy. She turned to her father, her voice trembling not from fear, but from triumph. "Daddy," she whispered, "the flowers are not afraid of the dark anymore, and neither am I." The words struck Alexander with the force of revelation. He knelt beside her, tears gathering as he pulled her into his arms. For months, he had carried guilt like a stone in his chest, believing his absence had carved wounds too deep to mend. But here, in the laughter of a child and the bloom of a tulip, he saw proof that light could return, that innocence could rise again from ashes. He held her close, his tears mingling with her hair. "You are braver than anyone I have ever known," he whispered, "and I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of you." The days unfolded in rhythms new and precious. Alexander, once measured by stock tickers and contracts, now measured time in storybooks read, in walks through the park, in tulips opening one by one. He canceled flights, refused meetings, ignored the calls of advisors who still spoke in the language of billions. "I have something more valuable," he told them simply, and hung up. Even the staff noticed the transformation. The mansion, once echoing with silence and formality, now rang with Sophie's laughter. Guards who once moved like shadows now smiled when she skipped past. The cook, once preparing meals for politicians, now learned to bake cookies shaped like tulips, because Sophie liked them best. At night, Alexander still wrote in his leather-bound notebook, filling its pages with fairy tales of heroes and flowers, of fathers who never left, of children who conquered shadows. He read them aloud, and Sophie's eyes glowed as though each word stitched another wound closed. Healing was not instant. Some nights Sophie still woke in tears, whispering of bitter water, of shadows by the bed. But Alexander was there, always there, holding her, rocking her, whispering into her hair, "It's over. You're safe. Daddy's here." Each time the fear faded faster. Each time trust grew deeper. The world outside still clamored with scandal. Clara's trial concluded with a sentence that made headlines, her name etched forever in disgrace. Reporters begged for statements, for interviews, for Alexander to appear once more as the titan whose personal life had shaken the empire. But he refused. "The story is not mine," he told Harris, who remained a quiet presence. "It is hers, and she deserves peace, not spectacle." So he retreated further into the life he had almost lost, a life measured not by empire, but by moments. Sophie's hand slipping into his as they crossed a garden path, her voice calling "Daddy" with unshaken trust, her laughter rising like music against the sky. One evening, as the sun melted into gold across the horizon, Sophie ran into the garden again. The tulips stood tall now, radiant in full bloom, their petals catching the light like flames. She twirled among them, her hair glimmering, her laughter filling the dusk. Alexander watched from the porch, his chest aching with a joy so fierce it was almost pain. He stepped forward, joining her among the flowers, kneeling as she picked one gently and held it out to him. "For you, Daddy," she said. He took it, pressing it against his chest. "No," he whispered. "For us." And in that moment, he knew. His wealth was not the towers that bore his name, nor the accounts swelling in foreign banks. His wealth was here, in a tulip offered by a child who had faced the dark and bloomed anyway. He lifted Sophie into his arms, spinning her once beneath the fading sun. She shrieked with delight, her arms flung wide, fearless. And as the garden glowed in the last light of spring, Alexander Grant understood at last. Empires crumble, fortunes vanish, but love, pure, unyielding, eternal, was the only kingdom worth ruling. Thank you for watching until the end. This story reminds us, no fortune is greater than love, no empire stronger than a child's trust. If it touched you, please subscribe and join us for more stories of hope and healing. And if someone you know needs light in their darkest hour, share this video with them. See you in the next story.